Hello everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Gaming in the Wild, a video games podcast about games from the artistic, creative side of the tracks, from indie to AAA. My name's John, I'm your host, and this week in Reykjavik, I actually just landed back in Iceland yesterday after a vacation, after a holiday. I went back to the UK to visit my parents, as they both had COVID last month and it hit them pretty hard. But they're recovering really well, so it was really good to see them in good spirits and good health. And while I was over there, I decided to go to a concert. I wanted to see the band Low. I've been a big fan of theirs for many years, and they were playing in Manchester. So I went to see Low play their new album in Manchester Cathedral, a beautiful, giant, old cathedral space with a massive pipe organ behind the stage. And it was just spectacular. I'm so glad that I went. I wore my mask. I stood at the back, but I did it. I actually went out and was amongst people. I was one of the only ones wearing a mask, but I don't know. I still haven't had COVID, so I feel like I am safe and conservative, but I'm just doing my best out here. It also coincidentally turned out that the band Mitski was in town while I was there. So I went to see Mitski. It was another sold-out show, and Mitski was great. I've listened to just a little bit of Mitski, but I really fell in love with it after the concert and have been listening just on repeat. And it was really nice to be out of Iceland, away from work, and just in a new city. Stayed in a nice hotel in the city centre near the Northern Quarter, which is like the neighbourhood with the cool coffee shops and bookstores and all that kind of stuff. So I just walked around, milled around the streets, ate nice food. Didn't play any games, hardly any at all. When I planned this trip, I bought a bunch of Switch games that people had recommended as being good for travel, and then proceeded to barely pick up my Switch for the whole time. But I don't know, maybe that's a good thing. I was just thinking about other things and doing other things, and I had a really good time. But now I'm back in Iceland. The temperature here is still 8 degrees. It's not the 21, 22 that I had over in the UK, so it feels like I've stepped back a season a little bit. But there have been some good summer days here in Iceland, so I'm hoping that the sky will brighten up. We need some blue sky over here. And when I flew back, I took the red-eye flight, which is never a good idea. But you know, those EasyJet flights that are half the price of other flights, they just tempt you every time. And then you realise that you're going to have to get up at 3:30 in the morning to get to the airport in time to check in. So I took the red-eye back and landed yesterday. I was wiped out for the whole day. But one thing that I did was to pick up my Switch, and I thought I want to play something calm and something nice, something low-key. And so I picked up a game that was recommended by a patron of the show, Joe, who is on Twitter at New Dawn Games. Joe makes great videos. You should definitely follow Joe. And he had recommended that I pick up Before I Forget, an indie game that I'd heard a little bit about, but hadn't picked up for one reason or another. And I finally did. I finally got around to it. I played it on my Switch. It only takes an hour to play through it. It's the perfect game for coming down from a holiday and being really sleepy but wanting something to occupy you. And there is some nice qualities that this game has that I wasn't expecting. And so Before I Forget will be the featured game of this episode. But before we get to that, I actually went on a bit of a spending spree on my Switch today. I don't know about you guys, but I keep a pretty long and inclusive wish list on my Switch in the eStore. And I'll check it every week and see what's on sale and try and pick up a couple games that I've wanted to play. Because I'm playing so many, it just makes sense for me to try and grab things on sale, so I'm not just spending a fortune, so I can afford to do it, basically. And it turned out that there were so many games on my wish list that was suddenly on sale all at once. And so I just went a bit nuts today. So I'm going to talk through just a couple of the games that I bought. The first one is World End Syndrome. This was a visual novel that came out last year. There was a lot of talk about it at the time. A lot of people were recommending it as a really interesting sci-fi visual novel. And I have only played a couple of visual novels and I want to play more. And the fact that this one came so recommended from so many different people got my eye on it, and it was reduced from £35 down to £8, and so it just seemed like the time to jump. It's never been that low before. I also bought the game Goner. I'm not exactly sure about Goner. I don't know exactly what this game is, but someone had recommended it to me on Twitter. I've got the feeling that it's probably a quite hard platformer, but it was reduced down to £3, and it was on my wish list, and I thought, well, now's the time. I also bought Into the Breach, which is, from the screenshots, looks like an Advance Wars style tile-based strategy game, turn-based strategy game. I haven't played one of those for quite a while. I did pick up a little bit of Advance Wars on my Game Boy last year, and with Advance Wars delayed for the time being, I thought maybe now's the time to get Into the Breach. That was, again, just a couple of pounds. I also picked up Cosmic Star Heroine. This is a game that was off my radar completely, but so many people recommended it in my thread about holiday games for the Switch. It just seemed very timely that it suddenly was on a deep sale, so I picked that one up too. And I also got Absolute Drift. This is a game that I've had my eye on for ages. It's a Zen-like top-down racing game from the guy who made Art of Rally, and whilst I wasn't a big Art of Rally fan, I couldn't quite get my head around the controls. I thought like a simplified version that's just all about drifting and freedom might be more my speed. It looks visually very clean, and that was just £3 as well. So there's so many games on sale for the Switch right now. Those I'm looking forward to playing all of those, and I will play them across the course of this year. A lot of them are shorter experiences as well, so they lend themselves to doing a weekly games podcast like I do. Like, you can have as many big games going on like Elden Rings and Horizons and stuff as you like, but you still have to have something new to talk about every week, so it's great to have a few indie games in the back pocket for the podcast. I also bought Norco, and this is a game that has been firmly on my radar for quite a while. Jacob Geller on YouTube did a great video about it and spoke about it in the same breath as Disco Elysium and Kentucky Route Zero, two of my favourite games of the last few years, possibly ever, certainly in the case of Kentucky Route Zero. And I have nothing but admiration for Disco Elysium, which is a heavyweight literary game in a way that I've not experienced in any other game. It's so interesting and so deep. The scenario is so deep. The characters are so well written and well rounded. It just seems to wield an ambition that you don't find in a lot of games. And so, for a game to be in the ring with those two critically is interesting enough to perk my ears up. Norco was only available on Windows last I checked, although it is also on Game Pass for Windows. But as a Mac user, I was waiting for the Mac version or for console versions, but it's out on Mac now. And so I pounced on it, bought it, and I played 5 hours of it today, just whilst I was listening to some sports on the radio and getting my energy back after that long flight and that day of travel yesterday. And I'm absolutely into this game. It is a pixel art game. It's a point-and-click adventure, but there's something very interesting about this one. It's text-heavy, but it uses that very clever vertical text window that Disco Elysium uses, so you're never reading more than a couple of lines at once. It's like you're consuming tweet-length bullets of text that come in rapid succession. So it never feels like you're sitting down looking at the screen and reading an essay. It's broken down into these really nice, small, poetic slices of text. And it's written in a very dreamy and poetic way. It's a near-future science fiction game in which you're returning to your hometown after the death of your mom to try and untangle what happened and what is going on in the town. And you get some history, you get some extremely interesting local characters. There is a domestic robot that you'll get to know. And you're kind of following a trail of clues, trying to find your brother, trying to find out what happened to your mom, and to find out what's happening to the town. The town is in a bad state. It's a near-future American dystopia, a little bit like Kentucky Route Zero. And I'm not going to talk about it more here because it will probably be the featured game on next week's episode, but I will say that my early impressions of this one are that it's something pretty special, actually. It's involved, it's deep, it's beautiful, it's well written. I feel attached to the scenario and the characters. I'm enjoying all of the gameplay. The way that the pixel art is used scene by scene in a similar way to Signs of the Sojourner, if you've played that game, where there is like a backdrop that represents each scene and characters appear on it. You talk to them. But in Norco, you can also click on details in that point and click adventure way. It never feels like you're pixel hunting, but it does feel like you have some room to notice things in the screen and get more context and more story. It also has a beautiful soundtrack, an ambient electronic soundtrack, and that really goes a long way with me. So it's sometimes when I look away from the screen just to grab a snack or check phone or stroke the cat or whatever, I realize after a few minutes that I've just been sort of doing other things and listening to the music. The music is so good that I can just leave it on. Sometimes there is rain sound or wind sound, incidental background sounds. It's a very soothing soundscape. The pixel art is beautiful. I'm having a great time with Norco. So expect to hear more about that one soon. And before we talk about Before I Forget, let me just say thank you to the show's newest patron, Aaron White. Thanks very much, Aaron, for supporting the podcast. And if you would like to become a supporter, you can do so at patreon.com/gaminginthewild for $1, £1, or €1 a month. And for that, you will get a few bonus episodes each year on things like music and video game soundtracks and other off-topic subjects. You'll get an invite to the Discord server that the show runs, where you can talk to me and talk to the other patrons of the show, find out what they're playing, see screenshots and get sale recommendations, conversations about the big games of the moment, such as Elden Ring, talk about what's coming to Game Pass, chat about all kinds of game and life things. It's a really fun place. It's a really fun little community. And it also gives me a lot of optimism for the show. I always love to see that people are enjoying the episodes. And so the support matters a lot. If that's interesting to you, you can go to patreon.com/gaminginthewild. And with that said, let's move on to the featured game of this episode, Before I Forget. So Before I Forget came out in 2020. It is by Threefold Games, which is an indie studio in Bristol in the UK. It was published by Humble Originals, and it has a soundtrack by Dave Tucker that features heavily in the game. And I really enjoyed it. It's the piano music that we're listening to now. It's a short first-person story, could be described as a walking simulator about, among other things, memories, losing them, remembering them, what they mean, and how we remember the things that we have done in life. And it touches on other themes such as regret, remembrance. It's an emotional game, it's an emotional play, and a well-told story. It was nominated for a BAFTA award for the Games for Change in 2021. It did quite well with critics, although there weren't that many reviews for this game, surprisingly. Metacritic has it at 76 on Switch and 88 on Xbox, although both of those aggregate scores were taken from only 4 reviews each, so not widely reviewed. How Long to Beat has the game at 1 hour. The game does advise you at the start that it's a single sitting game, and I played it in a single sitting and it clocked in at 1 hour exactly, so I assume that that's how long it will take everyone. The developers described this game as a woman alone in a house, a mystery and a love story, explore the present to uncover the past, in a short story of love, loss and a life well lived, which is a really expert and well done distillation of what this game is about. And I will say before I start the review of this game that I went into this one completely blind. I really didn't know what to expect of it. I knew that it touched on memory as a theme, but I hadn't read beyond that. And it was really good for me to go in that way because I wasn't expecting it to be about what it was about. It's quite complex subject matter. It touches on some really interesting things that are rare topics for video games to broach. And so if you are thinking of playing this game, or if you've bought it and you have it already on your Switch or on your Xbox, then I would say play the game first and come back to this podcast later. It only takes 1 hour, so it's a bite-sized game that you'll finish in one night. And as always, I'm going to try and keep the podcast spoiler-free until I flag it otherwise. But because the game is so short, and because the narrative is so tied into the gameplay and how it looks and how it sounds, it's going to be a little hard to talk about this one whilst skating around the meat of the topic. There are story spoilers that I won't mention until later on, and I will definitely say when I'm going to broach that territory. But I think going in as blind as I did gave me a really good experience of this game. So if you would like to have that experience too, then just pop back later on. So this is a 1-hour narrative game that takes place entirely in a small apartment. It's a walking simulator in which you walk between just a few rooms. And it's an apartment that tells a story. So I guess it's in that Gone Home Edith Finch-y territory of games, but it does it in a very different and interesting way. It has a very clean visual style that I really enjoyed. So as you're walking through this house, you'll see nice details. You'll see umbrella racks. You can look at the paintings on the wall. You can look at the furniture and the crumpled bedding. It's all line drawn. And it's quite crisp and beautiful. I really liked the look of this game. The soundtrack was also great. The piano score is really lovely. The music is well used. You'll sometimes hear it coming from different parts of the apartment, and it will lead you to places. And it's just very lyrical, and it really sets the tone for the game. I think that the audio-visual aspect of this game, the presentation of it, is very strong. And does a great service to the themes and the story of the game as things progress. And what you're doing in this game is that you're walking around the rooms of the apartment. You are looking at objects that you find. Some of them have memories attached to them. So if you pick up an umbrella, for example, your protagonist will recite a memory about meeting her husband, in which he had the umbrella and she hid under it with him, and he invited her for a drink, and she said, well, I guess I better go because that's where the umbrella's going. So you get these little snippets of the life of the protagonist of this game, and she tells you those stories, she speaks out loud, she talks to herself, and she narrates the apartment, she narrates the objects that you're finding. And so you're on a little journey, you're along for the ride with Sunita, the protagonist of the game. And as you explore this apartment, it starts to become apparent that Sunita is disoriented. She doesn't seem entirely sure what is going on. She's picking up things like bills that are addressed to her. She's looking for her husband. She's shouting, "Why hasn't this been paid?" And she's walking around. She can't find her husband in the apartment. She doesn't know where he is. She's expecting him home any time. She goes into the kitchen. She finds notes that have been left for her, lots of them, sticky post-it notes that have been stuck to things, such as telling her not to use the stove, telling her to eat the sandwich that is in the fridge. And she is confused by them. They are signed Maria, and she gets very confused about what is happening in the apartment. She can't find the bathroom when she needs it. She's struggling to live life alone in this apartment. And you, as the player of the game, realize pretty quickly that Sunita is suffering from some form of mental illness. And I think I should just say at this point that pretty much everything I'm going to say from now on is going to go into spoiler territory. So if you do want to play this game, now's the time to bail. And so you do discover that Maria is Sunita's living assistant, and she comes in and she tries to look after Sunita. She tries to leave meals for her and to help her orientate herself, but she's not always there. And so Sunita is often at home alone, and she's always struggling. You start to realize that she's forgotten who she is. You find things like certificates of achievement. You find things like photographs of her, and she will look at the photograph and she'll say, well, it looks like me, but it's so much older. And so Sunita in her mind is way back in time, an earlier stage of her life. And so an aspect of this game is piecing together who Sunita is and the life that she has lived. And as you're looking at things in the apartment, such as old concert flyers or old ticket stubs or photographs or sentimental objects, you start to learn about Sunita and the life that she lived, who she is. And the sad and beautiful thing about the game is that Sunita is learning these things at the same time as you are, because her condition has just taken her memories from her. And you start to realize that she's probably learning these things every time she looks at a picture, every time she looks at these notes that she sees every single day. It's like she's discovering them for the first time. And so there is a sense of loss, there is a sense of melancholy, and a sense of sadness and pain that comes with having dementia and with conditions that make you lose your memory. And she does sometimes get frustrated. She doesn't quite understand what's happening. There is a sequence in which she needs the bathroom, but every door that you open takes you back to a room that you've just been in. It's pretty distressing. And she also doesn't know where her husband is, and that's the big mystery of the game, really, is she's looking for her husband, Dylan. He is a concert pianist and a very successful one. And as you're walking around the apartment, you'll find wedding pictures, you'll find cards that they were given to celebrate their marriage. You'll find notes from Dylan that he sent to her from when he was on tour around the world. You'll find a record of Sunita's life. You'll find her certificates of achievement. She is a cosmologist. I had to look up what a cosmologist is and why it's different from an astronomer, but it turns out that cosmology is a strand of astronomy that deals with the universe as a whole. And so Sunita is a highly qualified academic, and her husband is a renowned concert pianist. So they are this high-functioning couple. But you're finding Sunita at a moment later in her life, after all of these things have happened. She has had to drop out of her professional life, and you'll find notes from people that were written during the course of her illness earlier in her life, when she was going through some really traumatic stuff with a husband who is a musician who's always away, and losing her memory, but perhaps not knowing why, or not knowing what's happening in her life. And so you discover the story of Sunita and Dylan. You discover the course of Sunita's illness. And you do all of this by looking at objects. You pick them up, you can rotate them, and Sunita will have flashbacks, or she'll give spoken comments about what she remembers. And when you find an object that triggers a memory, a splash of color will appear around it. And you realize that this apartment is very desaturated. There is not a lot of color to be seen. And I thought that was very clever, actually. It feels like Sunita's condition has stolen the memories from her, and it's also stolen the color from her life. There is a sense of sadness, a sense of depression almost, that comes with Sunita's confusion. And when she does see these objects, and when she hears a piece of music that resonates with her, and she finds a note from Dylan, it lights up her life a little bit again, just for a moment. And these splashes of colour appearing in the apartment really brought that home. It's very effective and very well done. So I would say that the best things about this game are the way that the story is told. I thought that the way it unfolded was very clever. I thought that the fact that you were learning Sunita's past at the same time as she was very effective. I found it to be a very pretty game, a very sad game. The way that she combs through the memories of her life, the way that she is re-experiencing them, is very interesting. It's unusual narratively in that way, and the way that we attach value to memory later in life was an interesting topic too. The things that we find important, or the process of going through a game where you play as someone who is re-evaluating and revisiting the big moments of their life and the decisions that they took, I thought was very effective. And there is also a really unusual twist in that you figure out certain twists before Sunita does, which gives you a kind of a heartbreaking foreknowledge of things that she isn't privy to yet, and has forgotten, but it feels like she must discover in the course of the game. And this is another big spoiler, but if you're still along for the ride now, I guess you've played the game or you don't care. So you'll find Dylan's wedding band in a drawer. Sunita picks it up and looks at it and says, "I have one just like this." And then she puts it back in the drawer. And this is a devastating moment because, I mean, at first I thought Dylan's taken off the wedding band and he's away on tour. And so, much like in the game Firewatch, where the protagonist is escaping from his marriage because of a difficult mental condition of his partner, I thought perhaps Dylan is living as someone unmarried because he feels that his partner isn't really there anymore in the way that he knew her. It doesn't turn out to be that. It turns out that Dylan died, and she just doesn't remember that. So the way that this story unfolds and the way that it tells you these things is really interesting. It's interesting to find notes pinned up on a wall and for them to look blank until you look at them, and then to see the writing appearing as you read it, which speaks to Sunita's unearthing and re-experiencing of memories, of blank pages where words should be in her mind. It's all very clever. I felt that it was narratively coherent, and that was tied together with the music. It was tied together with the visuals, the color splashes, the notes filling themselves in. This is all clever. These are all clever decisions that have been taken to express what the game is about. And they are very effective, and I really appreciated that as I was playing the game. As for bad points of this game, I think it's pretty perfect at what it's trying to do. But as someone that plays a lot of games, there are a couple things that jumped out as frustrations. One is that it's a walking simulator in which the walking doesn't feel great. It's slow. I guess you're playing an older lady with dementia, and so she should, there's hardly going to be a jump button. But when you find an object, there is a voice acting piece that triggers, you get a few lines of dialogue, and it slows down for that time to stop you from moving away from that object. And so there is this feeling of frustration. I don't like it in games when you are forced to slow down. The only game that's ever done it well is Journey. I've said it a lot on this podcast. Every game has moments where you're walking through a snowstorm and suddenly you're walking half pace, or you're in a conversation and you can't walk full speed. It just feels like your freedom is being taken away from you. That happens in this game too. There is constant moments where you can't move. You just have to sort of sit there, and that gets on my nerves in any game, and it got on my nerves in this one. I would say that the game is described as being packed with objects to look at, but there weren't that many really. I would say that in the 6 or 7 rooms that you walk through, it's hard to miss anything, and there were only 3 or 4 objects in each room. So to say that the game is packed with objects to look at, it's not really, but that's just a thing that was used in the marketing language. It's not really a criticism of the game. In terms of the gameplay and the story, I think there was a fine number of objects to look at in terms of serving the story for sure, but it did make it feel like perhaps more of a passive experience than an active one. You can't exactly pick things up in the apartment, move them around. You can't look at everything. You can't file through, drawers, every drawer. Some cupboards are just there for show. And so you're really just walking between the objects that you're allowed to look at. So it doesn't have that feeling of freedom of being able to look at anything you want. But that's fine. It serves the story fine. You're just looking at the significant objects of Sunita's life. Those are the only criticisms that I have, really. I thought that the short length was fine. I thought that the look of it was great. I thought the music was excellent. I thought the subject matter was a brave thing to tackle, and it was tackled sensitively. And I really enjoyed learning about Sunita's life, even if it's from the point of view of tragedy. Finding out that Dylan was actually dead was... it's a little twist in the stomach when you realize that Sunita doesn't know that, and that she's re-experiencing it again. You also get some visual distortions that occur at different times where, for example, Sunita will see a black hole in the floor that she can't go near. There is another sequence in which you'll walk down a corridor that doesn't seem to end. And so she is having these visual distortions that are apparently a part of dementia. And it's a difficult game in those ways. It's not easy subject matter, but it's very well crafted. And altogether, I would say that I'm glad that I played this one. It took 1 hour. It's only £6. It's on Switch and Xbox and PC. I would say that if you're interested in walking simulators, if you're interested in short narrative experiences, just if you're interested in game design, actually, I would say that from any of those perspectives, this is definitely worth playing. That's Before I Forget. So that was Before I Forget. Hope you enjoyed my review of it. It was an interesting game. It was a sad game. I do like indie games that do what they do and they do it quickly. I do like games that don't feel the need to stretch out playtime and that are concise. And this game was very concise. It was considered. They knew what they wanted to do and they did it well. If you've played Before I Forget, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. You can reach me on Twitter at Gaming in the Wild. I'm also on Instagram and other social media. You can follow me there if you'd like to hear about new episodes of the show as they come out, or to just chat with me or recommend games for the show. I always like to hear from people that have listened to the show, so feel free to get in touch. You are also, of course, welcome to support the show on Patreon. It's patreon.com/gaminginthewild if you're interested in doing that, joining the Discord community. I will put a link in the show notes, so you can click on that if that's interesting to you. I have also been getting a few lovely reviews of the show on iTunes and some star ratings on Spotify, all of which I very much appreciate. So if you have the time or inclination, that's also something that I appreciate a lot. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Thanks very much for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other, and bye-bye for now.